Welcome to this lightning talk on using rhythm analysis as a means to explore public, nursing staff and student perceptions of district nursing. My name is Stephanie Reynolds. I'm a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University. I teach adult nursing on the pre-registration nursing programme and I've got a background in community nursing and district nursing. So I started my educational doctorate last year and started to explore my positionality, and this is what led to kind of thinking around this area, obviously with my background being a district nurse. Rhythm analysis came about to be a good method to explore some of the murmurs that I had surrounding community nurse and community nurse education, which we'll look at later on in the presentation. But to just outline what a community nurse is. So a community nurse is someone who looks after patients outside of hospital. It could be in their own home, it could be at GP surgeries, it could be in care homes, anywhere that it's a patient's home that they're not actually going into acute setting where to get specialist care if they were really, really ill. So they come home, they could be needing rehabilitation, they could just be needing support if they've got sort of palliative care needs or something like that. But essentially a community nurse is a lone worker, so they go and visit patients in their own home, and they would obviously need to make sure that it's safe to go there. They need to be thinking about their own safety as well as obviously the independence and promoting the independence of the patient. So they would maybe do a half an hour visit and need to know that patient was going to be safe. They can manage their own independence. It's not that someone else takes over and that's the end of the shift. You need to be thinking about the long-term plan. How can that patient be safe at home? How is that patient best cared for? And the skills that are used are good assessment skills, good wider knowledge, good care planning skills, and good experience, things that maybe student nurses don't always see when it comes to the delivery of care, if you like. So this rhythm analysis is a good theory to use in my research because as we go on to explore in the slides, it uncovers things that are maybe hidden to the public eye, things that have become almost a culture in themselves that need to sort of be unpicked to see how that culture has arisen, how certain things have become a foregone conclusion. So if I was to ask you the question and you didn't think too much about it, it was kind of one of those questions where we surveyed 100 people and the top 3 answers were this. I could almost guarantee that the top answer would be that nurses work in hospital. So there is a starter for 10. You've got this whole idea that nurses work in hospital, whereas actually if you look at literature, we're supposed to be moving more services out into the community. The 5-year forward states that there's a need to expand those services in the community so people can be cared for in their own home and not in hospital. And the Willis Commission in 2015 went further to say that nurse education needs to be redefined so that it has got this specialist community element. All those things I said about being autonomous and being lone workers, there is that kind of need to have specialist education in that area, and even maybe it's its own field. So at the moment we've got adult field, learning disability field, child field and mental health field. So should community be a field of its own? That's what the Willis Commission did actually sort of question. But it's almost like this in education now that this zeitgeist has occurred, whereas the complete opposite has happened. What we're requiring students to have is more skills in the technical field, things that have been added to the curriculum such as venipuncture, cannulation, all things that are required for the emergency acute hospital nursing situation. So as a community nurse in that kind of environment of education, whereby I've got this background in community nursing, which is all about skills in assessment, in communication, and looking out for the patient's sort of independence and rehabilitation. When you're teaching in an environment that is very hospital led, it almost feels like you're sort of the outsider, and I refer to works by sort of Foucault and Butler in that respect. So Butler in particular talks about gender performativity and how if you're born a certain gender it means you must it's almost expected that you behave a certain way. So boys, you assume that they'll be into football, girls, into dolls and the whole pink, blue and dresses and that kind of thing is assumed. So being a community nurse in nurse education, I hadn't noticed it before until I came into education, but it's almost as if I felt like the outsider, like that nursing takes place in hospital. Community nursing is a strange phenomena that you might want to go into if you want to do something different. But ultimately, if you come into nurse training, it's almost like assumed that you will work into hospital. So as I've alluded to already, when I explored my positionality as a community nurse, it led me to explore murmurs and this troubling that kind of was there under the surface. And also things were coming out from the students as well, that they'd been advised by hospital staff that actually if they were to work in the community straight from qualifying, they'd be de-skilled. And I would really question what do they mean by these skills. And I would think that, there's this whole looking at skills as though they were technical. So these things like I've mentioned already, like venipuncture, cannulation, technical skills, is that what defines a nurse? Or is it the whole kind of looking wider, doing thorough assessments, having the knowledge to apply and managing care? That seems to have, the technical aspects of skills seem to have overridden this whole knowledge, application and managing patients' quality care. So let's have a look at some of these murmurs versus the reality that I actually see. So there is this murmur that's community nursing. It's somewhere you go if you're a qualified nurse and you've done your stint in hospital, and you might just want to slow down a bit. You want to slow down the pace. It might be somewhere you want to move out to if you're thinking about having kids or retire. It's all this kind of slower pace kind of approach where you go and you sit and have a cup of tea with the patients and have a chat. Okay, but the reality is actually that community nursing has become busier than ever. We are having quicker hospital discharge as a result of trying to move things out into the community, but that means more dependent patients, and actually you've got this no beds full. In hospital, once all your beds are full, you can agree that your capacity remains sort of in a controllable state, whereas in the community there is no beds full. Patients can keep coming out and still require a lot of care in the process. So I've just said about being de-skilled in the community, and that this whole perception that real nursing happens in hospital, and that was seen also in the media when more recently when we were thinking about COVID. It was almost as if nursing and care didn't happen outside of hospital because they initially all the figures were coming out of hospital, and then all of a sudden they realised actually we were getting a lot of figures coming from care homes as well, and the whole care home sector was sort of almost came out of the woodwork, if you like. So because that we're getting these quicker hospital discharges and we're getting these more dependent patients, it means that more skills are actually required in the community, and furthermore, to add to that, you are a lone worker. So the more skills you're having to do on your own and rely on your own judgment and your own kind of ability to know exactly what you're doing and be able to document that. So to explore further even more into these murmurs and my positionality, I reflect back on somebody saying to me when I first qualified as a district nurse whether I was going on to do midwifery, and I found that quite strange because I thought, well, why once I've become a district nurse would I want to be a midwife, because I would have done that sooner. But it's almost as if public perception is it can't understand what district nursing is. It's almost like a different type of nursing. So if it's not nursing, it must be something that's aligned to midwifery perhaps. And then another area was having to teach students the skill of counting respiratory breaths as a skill. And actually this only really relates to hospital nursing. You would only really count breaths in a sort of emergency situation to find out what's going on physiologically. Whereas in the community you would simply know if someone was short of breath or if they had breathing difficulties that was connected to some sort of long-term condition. You wouldn't routinely go into a patient's house and think, oh, I better count the respiratory breaths as a routine thing. So actually have to teach that as a major skill in university seemed really quite odd and really sort of foreign to me, and made me question as to why it was so important that we did this kind of thing when we weren't considering maybe some of the wider issues related to breathing as well. Then you've got the media portrayal of nurses being frontline and therefore in hospital and portrayed as lifesavers in the emergency. So this is, again, this whole frontline thing can be seen again in this COVID crisis that we've just had. Everyone had to put all hands on the deck, and that was perceived that you had to go out back into the front line in hospital. And that's, again, is connected to this whole lifesaver thing, the emergency situation. Whereas I can recall looking back on a picture that I had taken with a patient and remembering the journey I had with the patient and how I actually saved his life, because I had the knowledge to be able to diagnose that he'd got an arterial leg ulcer, which was ultimately giving him a lot of pain, and it could have resulted in a leg amputation. So what I actually did was save his life and gave him a better quality of life, but it wasn't necessarily the emergency situation that we're kind of built up and led to believe that is the the nurse, so to speak. So where do we go from here? So I'd quite like to find out some of the stories of my fellow colleagues who have also been community nurses and nurse lecturers. So obviously we've sort of maybe shared a few of the same kind of feelings about things, but it'd be useful to really sort of explore any stories or any kind of recalling of murmurs that they may have that might contribute to this research. And also look into a bit more detail the historical context of nurse education and the shift that happened when nurse education went to university, and what this meant for community nurses and the nursing placement, the student nursing placement. Because what actually happened was that when the shift happened from hospital training to university training, community placements became more available, and students went out into communities of placement experience and an assessed placement experience as opposed to just an observation. And this sort of seemed to redefine community nursing as being part of general nursing, but didn't necessarily mean that it has had that lasting context in terms of nursing education. So it'd be useful to sort of look at that and what that's meant for community nurses as well. So over to you now, really, to sort of discuss any thing that's been in the presentation, or any questions you may have, or any if this has sort of challenged any perceptions that you might have had of community nursing.